The collapse of the healthcare system brought on by COVID-19 is a reminder of how important the healthcare industry is to all of us. At Medical Korea 2022's Global Conference, we look at the current trends in healthcare and what the future might hold for the industry. Invited to this event are medical and public health experts who will talk about the latest developments and future outlook on medical care and medical tourism, as well as the convergence of medicine and technology.
Hello everyone and welcome to Medical Korea 2022 Global Healthcare and Medical Tourism Conference. I'm your host, Na Hyun-kyung. Today we'll hear from healthcare experts from Korea and abroad about the latest trends in the industry while also discussing the future direction of the medical and healthcare sector as a whole, along with suggestions on which path to take going forward. Entering its 12th year since its inception, Medical Korea is holding a conference concurrently with its exhibition, which is being held at COEX in Seoul under the theme Global Healthcare, A New Leap Forward. Our station, Arirang TV, will be airing some of the key segments of the event as well. Now, the importance and notion of public health has become all the more crucial because we are living in the pandemic era, so I do hope that today's session will help shed more light to the latest developments in the industry and things that we ought to know as individuals. Medical Korea 2022 will be aired in two parts, so without further ado, let's begin with part one.
Demographic changes and the advent of new technologies are transforming our world, with women poised to join the workforce in larger numbers over the coming years, and the global economic landscape undergoing a seismic shift. How will the healthcare sector evolve in this new world?
So the theme for session one is Global Healthcare, A New Leap Forward, and here to deliver the keynote speech is Professor Mauro Guillen, who is the Dean of the Cambridge Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Welcome to the conference, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at Medical Korea 2022. It's an honor and a pleasure to share with you some thoughts about the topic of my presentation, which is new directions of development in the global healthcare industry in the next normal era. I would like to tell you about four very important topics that I think should be at the top of our minds when thinking about the future of healthcare. I will tell you about changing demographics. I will also tell you about some technological trends that I think are very likely to transform healthcare. And I will also tell you about the phenomenon of medical tourism, which is growing very fast around the world. And finally, about the very peculiar and important role that women will play in all of these transformations. Let me begin with demographics. There are two key things that we need to remember about demographics. The first is the decline in fertility, that is to say, the number of babies born to each woman in the world on average. And the second is rising life expectancy, that is to say, the average number of years that people live. Here on the chart, you see the evolution of fertility in different parts of the world since the year 1950 to the year 2020 with actual data, that is roughly speaking in the center of the chart. And then the rest of the chart to the right are projections into the future. Vertically, we're measuring the total fertility rate, the number of babies born to each woman, estimated over her reproductive life. And we can see that the total for the world starts at a level of 5 babies per woman back in the year 1950, but today, as of the year 2022, is roughly speaking at a level 2.3 babies per woman. And the projection is that that number will continue to decline. But it's very important to keep in mind that this number is distributed around the world in a very uneven way. We see that in the developed countries at the bottom of the chart, the number had already fallen below the replacement level of 2 babies per woman back in the 1970s. This includes Japan, South Korea, Singapore, all of Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And as you can see, there was somewhat of a change in the trend around the year 2000, because surprisingly, the number started to increase very slowly. Now, this didn't happen in Japan or in Korea. It happened primarily in some European countries and in the United States and Canada, countries with relatively high levels of immigration. Because immigrant families, as has been very well documented, tend to have more children than other types of families. Now, the second tier of countries that we see on the chart are the so-called less developed countries. These are sometimes also referred to as the emerging markets. For many years, South Korea was in this group of countries, but now, of course, it is a highly developed country. So this is mostly China, India, Southeast Asia, other parts of South Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. What we see here is that the number has also been dropping very quickly from 6 in the 1950s, all the way down to about 2.2 or 2.3 nowadays, and it will continue to decline. And lastly, lying at the top are the least developed parts of the world. This is primarily parts of the Middle East and Africa. And what we can see here is that the levels peaked at about 7 babies per woman back in the 1970s. And since then, it has been declining. But as of today, observe very carefully that although the number of babies is declining everywhere in the world, it is still relatively high in the least developed parts of the world, especially Africa, where it is at a level of maybe about 4 babies per woman. So overall, decline in fertility, except for some European countries and the US and Canada, where because of the increase in immigration, the total fertility rate has since the year 2000 tended to go up very, very, very slowly. Now, as I said before, the other side of the coin when it comes to demographics is life expectancy. We want to know not only how many babies are born, but also how long those babies will live. Now, from this perspective, it's all very good news. Since World War II, since the 1950s, life expectancy measured in years has grown everywhere in the world. It has grown in the developed parts of the world, such as Japan or Europe or the United States. It has also increased in the emerging markets, and it has increased in the least developed parts of the world, which on the chart line at the bottom. Now, in addition to that, there's something really important that we need to observe on this chart, which is that the least developed parts of the world are catching up. They're reducing the gap that they used to have with the most developed countries in the world. So back in 1950, as you can see on the chart, the difference between a baby born in the least developed parts of the world and a baby born in the most developed parts of the world was about 30 years in life expectancy. But today, in the year 2022, the difference is only about 15 or 16 years. And in the future, we are expecting a further narrowing of the gap in terms of life expectancy. Now, this is also important because if the less developed parts of the world are catching up with the more developed parts of the world in terms of life expectancy, this is also going to have quite an impact. And you see, I think it's important for us to quantify exactly then how different populations in the world are going to evolve as a result of these changes in fertility and in life expectancy. Here we see a chart that starts in the year 1950, goes to the year 2020 with actual data about the center of the chart, and then the rest to the right of the chart are forecasts into the future. Vertically, we're measuring what percentage of the world's population is in different regions or parts of the world. And as you can see, we're going to see very dramatic changes over the next few years. I drew a vertical blue line indicating the year 2028. In that year, Africa, because it has more babies and its babies are catching up in terms of life expectancy, Africa is going to become the second biggest region in the world by population, becoming bigger than all of East Asia, which includes, of course, China, South Korea, Japan, and so on. For the first time, Africa will be the second biggest region in the world. Also that year, South Central Asia, which includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, will have leveled off, reached a maximum in terms of its percentage of the world population. And also in that year of 2028, we're going to see that Europe, that used to be the second biggest region in the world by population in the year 1950, will have fallen to place number 5 or number 6. So within the next 6 years, we're going to see dramatic changes in the makeup of the world population. Now, the two more significant trends for healthcare and for medicine have to do with the structure of the population by age. Here what we have, the largest countries in the world, in terms of how many people they will have by the year 2030 above the age of 60. In South Korea, today there are 11.9 million people above the age of 60. But by the year 2030, there's going to be 16.8 million people above the age of 60. But you see, in every country in the world, in China, in India, in the US, in Japan, in Russia, there's going to be more people above the age of 60. This is a key trend. But in addition to the demography, you should also take into account that this age group is going to have purchasing power. Of course, they're going to have, some of them at least, chronic diseases. And also, it's a segment of the population that is going to own most of the wealth in the world. Between 60 and 80% of the net worth, depending on the country, is owned by people above the age of 60. So this group of people above the age of 60 is going to be the most important in the world over the next 20 to 30 years. And it's a group that wants to have an active lifestyle, but it's also a group that eventually will need a lot of healthcare services because of chronic diseases. Now, the other big change when it comes to demography that I want to bring to your attention, one that will have important implications for healthcare and for medicine, is the ratio of how many people are between the ages of 15 and 59 to the number of people above the age of 60. So in other words, how many people are of working age relative to how many people we have above the age of 60. And as you can see, this number since the year 1950 has been declining very quickly. In South Korea, it was once at a level of 9.5 people of working age for every person above the age of 60. But nowadays in Korea, around the year 2020, the number is already below 3 people of working age for every person above the age of 60. And very soon, within the next 10 to 20 years, in many countries in East Asia, including Japan and South Korea, and also China, in Europe, there will be no more than 2 people of working age for every person above the age of 60. This is going to put a lot of pressure on the budget for the state, because not enough people perhaps will be working and paying taxes so that we can fund all of the pensions and also the healthcare for people above the age of 60. So that's also something that I wanted to bring to your attention. Besides changes in demographics, the other big trend that I see for healthcare in Korea and worldwide has to do with technology. New technologies like robotics, AI and big data, 3D printing, blockchain, and the metaverse are going to become really important. For example, the metaverse will be used not just for entertainment, but also for therapy in the cases of autism or dementia. And 3D printing may be used to come up with dental pieces or other kinds of objects that may needed during surgery. I see the applications of these new technologies in prevention, in care, in cure, in therapy, wellness, in the interaction between healthcare providers such as doctors and nurses and patients, for example, in the area of remote healthcare, and finally, efficiency, to reduce the costs of the overall healthcare. I see, for example, applications such as the one that you see on the photograph, a patient being taken care of by a robot at home, or the use of robotic pets such as Paru the seal, which is a Japanese invention, to help dementia patients overcome loneliness and feel better. I also see an increase in medical tourism. Some estimates say that it may grow by more than 400% over the next 5 years. And this will be driven by the search for lower costs, quality, and specialization by location in different parts of the world in terms of the healthcare and medical attention. But I also see a very important factor that we haven't mentioned yet, which is the accumulation of wealth at the top of the distribution. Here we see the number of high net worth individuals in the world. These are people with more than $1 million in net worth. Over the last 15 years, this number has more than doubled to reach 20 million people. And it has grown in every region of the world, including, of course, East Asia. In fact, for example, in South Korea, there were fewer than 200,000 of these relatively rich people just a few years ago. But today, there is 261,000 at the end of the year 2020, which is the last year for which we have complete data. Now, most of these people with those amounts of money will be above the age of 45, and many of them above the age of 60. And another very important thing that I want you to keep in mind is that women are also accumulating wealth, in fact, faster than men. That's because they are now working outside of the household. But they happen to be very important gatekeepers. They make a lot of decisions when it comes to the healthcare for their children and even for their husbands. So this is going to have a very important implication. The fact that women now are about to make more than half of all of these millionaires in the world, all of these people that have more than $1 million of net worth. Women in every country in the world, including South Korea, if they have money, they're more likely to spend more of that money on healthcare and on insurance when compared to men. So this is good news for healthcare. And also women are more risk averse on average, and they tend to care more about the future. So in summary, these are the big changes that I see in the future of medical care over the next few years. Demographic change, changes in technology that I think are going to make the healthcare sector more efficient and of course also of higher quality. I see globalization, especially in the case of medical tourism. And don't forget about women and the new role that they now have across the world and how that may also impact the healthcare industry. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Professor. I really did learn a lot. What you mentioned, everything, the changing demographics, social trends, new technologies, they will all affect the medical and healthcare industry. But one other element that will surely have an impact is the COVID-19 pandemic. How has COVID-19 influenced this industry?
COVID-19 is a big trend right now, even as we make our way out of the pandemic. It has changed the nature of healthcare. It has essentially promoted innovation, particularly in terms of the delivery of healthcare services in a virtual way through a platform, a digital platform. It's also great that we have managed to put in place a testing infrastructure and also a tracing infrastructure for future pandemics. And lastly, the other big advancement, of course, has to do with vaccine development. We have learned not only how to develop vaccines, but also to conduct clinical trials very, very quickly. I think what we have learned over the last 2 years during the pandemic will serve us very well in the future when confronting other health crises.
So you talked about promoting innovation, and by innovation, I'm just wondering if you also mean the convergence of different technologies and the traditional medical healthcare sector.
I think the near future will bring a convergence of different types of industries and different types of technologies. We're going to see this in the world of transportation. We're going to see this in the world of shopping. And of course, we're going to see it in the case of healthcare. Because I think we are defining now healthcare more broadly as well-being, meaning to help people have full lives throughout the life cycle at every age. I think we're going to see a convergence, for example, in terms of entertainment, healthcare, robotics, and also digital platforms. And in all of those fields, South Korea as an economy has very competitive companies that I think are going to be bringing to the world very important innovations. So I personally see a bright future for the Korean economy when it comes to the future development of medicine and the healthcare sector.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor, for your time today. It was a great opportunity for me to learn about the upcoming important trends and also about Korea's promising role in the global healthcare market. So thank you once again.
Faster and better services are needed in healthcare logistics and supply chains. With rapid growth and changes expected to take place within these sectors, what innovations could have the most notable impact on these services?
Services in healthcare and medicine are advancing by leaps and bounds on the back of growing technological and scientific innovations. Medical research remains a key driver of innovation in healthcare services, but the areas we also need not forget are those supporting and facilitating those innovations and in providing those services. So with that in mind, let's now turn to Mr. Niels Naman, who will tell us about the importance of healthcare logistics and where its future lies. So welcome to the conference, Mr. Naman, and thanks for virtually joining us.
Good day, everybody. My name is Niels van Namen, and I'm speaking to you from the wonderful country of the Netherlands. And it's a pleasure to be on, and I'd like to thank the organizers for having me on the call today. So I really love the theme of the conference that we're talking about. Global healthcare, a new leap forward. Because there's so much change happening in the global space of healthcare that I would love to contribute to today's discussion as well. I'd like to just do a quick introduction about myself. I'm in healthcare for about 25 years, started my career in clinical trials, and I have been working with medical device companies, with pharma companies, with hospitals ever since. Currently, I'm working at the global logistics company called Siva Logistics, where I'm the head of global healthcare. Really, the mission that we're having there, as you can see here, is making healthcare affordable and accessible for everyone on the globe. So there's a lot of logistics moves in air freight, ocean freight, logistics, contract logistics, but it's really about making sure that we put the patient central in everything we do. We serve the patient. The organizers shared a link with the TED Talk that I did a couple of years ago. And in that TED Talk, you can there's a couple of things that I talk about. And one of the key drivers, the important things in healthcare is that the costs are increasing. And we're going to talk about why that's happening and if that's a threat or an opportunity. You can see that in 40, 50 years, right, in Western European countries like Germany, but also in countries like the US, the cost of care, so the cost of healthcare as a part of the gross domestic product, as a part of GDP, has drastically increased, right? From 5.7, so it's doubled in Germany, and as you can see, it tripled in the US. And that's not stopping it. And some people say, well, it's not an issue, right? I believe it is an issue because it's the public's money, right? And we can only spend it once. So we also need to fund new roads and the schools and all those kind of things. So I think we should really think about how can we maybe better control that cost of care. On this picture, you can see that it's not just Europe or US, but also in Korea. And I found the numbers that we see that we really have grown, right? We've grown from around 3% to over 8% of GDP now as well. So the same trend is actually happening in your country as well. And how can we, all of us, right, not just in Korea or in my country, the Netherlands, how can we get better control of that growth of cost? Because there's a few drivers really increasing that care of cost. And how can logistics play a critical role in managing that transformation? really who wants to be in a hospital, right? In many countries and cultures, right, we don't want to be in a hospital for multiple reasons, right? And like I discussed there as well with people, it's not very convenient, right, to go to the hospital and wait there to just get your blood drawn. So there's a number of drivers that are really driving to take as much care as possible out of the hospital and bring it to patients' home. On top of that, if you realize that about 85% of the elderly, so 85% of the people over 65 years old, have at least one chronic disease. 60% of the elderly have at least two chronic diseases. And chronic diseases, folks, are the largest driver for cost. So if we can change that, right? If we can take some of that out, and you can see here another number that I've given, 46%, a recent study showed that 46%, so about half of what's currently happening in hospitals, can be brought to the patient's home. And typically, the majority of that is around chronic care. So as you can see here, the picture of a lady being treated by a nurse at home, right, is much more convenient for the patients. There's less risk involved for the patients. And overall, studies have shown that it's absolutely much, much less cost to treat chronic patients at home versus in the hospital. And as you can see on this chart, the hospitals will still be there. They will be very, very relevant, don't get me wrong. But hospitals will focus in the near future more and more on the acute care. And therefore, they might even get more decentralized and closer to the people. So we'll see the shift, or we'll see the split in a way, in really between chronic care, where there's a higher possibility for home care as well, and acute care, which we will see is more and more how the hospitals will be set up. And again, that's happening in different economies, in different parts of the world, in different healthcare systems as well. We see the same trend. So to make sure, and again, this is pre-COVID. COVID hit in multiple ways, and we've seen full hospitals. We've seen countries struggle with space, and how do we organize ourselves better to be flexible? So the move to home care, and again, the mix of hospital care and home care, it will never be one or the other, but a better mix of home care and hospital care will allow many countries to be much more flexible, to be more agile with taking care of the patients. And including Korea, you can see here the two snapshots that I took from your newspapers as well. Post-COVID, we've now seen countries wake up and really see, hey, how can we better make use of home care to not get into the circumstances again that we faced in the dire days around COVID, right? How can we indeed treat patients more at home? And this is a trend where also companies need to help facilitate that care. And typically hospitals are not laid out for that. Home networks are not there yet. And that's where I see companies like ours or other logistics companies that are not selling the healthcare products, but really managing the service of the home care delivery will play a critical role. And we see that again mainly in the chronic diseases. And we call it HONDA, right? So H for hypertension, O for obesity, N for non-compliance, not adherence to specific therapies, D for diabetes, and A for asthmatics. So these are really the 5 main chronic diseases that we'll see that have more and more will get the services delivered at home. So it's really about logistics companies that are fulfilling the patients, that are really helping the patients to be served from home. So on the next slide, I just want to take you through a couple of additional trends that are happening in healthcare, and that's why healthcare is changing, and we see a very leap forward, as the title of the conference says. So first of all, there's this book that I really like, the Eric Topol's book, which says the patient will see you now. In English, we see the doctor will see you now, but that's flipping, that's changing. So instead of we have to go to the doctor and wait and until the doctor has time, and then so it's really going to turn around. We see that technology, iPhone or mobile phone technology is really going to help facilitate that change. We're going to have a doctor on demand. right? So it's really the patient will see you now, and the doctor will flip the other way around. The doctors will still be there. The second thing here, the click here, is on applications like Babylon Healthcare. There's many more platforms that are really helping doctors to make better decisions. It's decision support for doctors to make the right diagnosis. And decision support is there in many management aspects for many years already. However, in healthcare, it's still, in many countries, still pretty new. So we'll see that triage and the whole process before actually the patient sees the doctor will be much more facilitated by mobile apps. On top of that, we see things like CAR-T and immunotherapies kick in. Very, very tailored new approaches. However, back to the opening statements of cost, driving healthcare cost up. And the market is changing away from a big market of 7.7 billion, everyone in the world, to even markets where the market is only one. My blood cells go to a hospital instead of me going to a hospital, right? My white blood cells will be put in boot camp in companies that are actually treating my own white blood cells to fight my own disease. So we'll see different channels, right? We see omni-channels. We see companies dealing with large markets, e-commerce markets, direct-to-patient markets, and very, very small markets as well. That's also a change that we need to facilitate in the already pretty complex supply chains. Because more and more of these products, as you can see here, are cold chain products, and we need to make sure we keep the integrity of the product so they don't go out of specifications, right? If the product is 2 to 8 Celsius, we need to make sure we keep that. But also the chain of custody, back to the idea of the white blood cells, right? My white blood cells better end up again in my blood and not in anyone else's blood. So we really need to make sure that these niche supply chains, these very, very important supply chains, are managed very, very well. And finally, there's this nice concept of value-based healthcare. Really making sure that everyone, not just logistics, not just the GPs and the doctors, not just the hospitals, but all of these stakeholders that are there for instance, a diabetes patient, are all aligned to maximize the outcomes for the patient. And that concept that Michael Porter, the Harvard professor, launched in 2006 with his value-based healthcare approach is something I see many countries embrace. So how can we set up a healthcare system, facilitate it in a way that we can maximize the outcomes for a patient? So these are all different trends happening in the new healthcare system, and there'll still be hospitals, there'll still be doctors, but we'll see that many things are changing in the healthcare world, in the healthcare supply chain. There'll be a leap forward as per the discussion that we're having today. To close it off, folks, and again, I'm working for Siva Logistics, a company where we focus on biopharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, e-commerce companies, diagnostics and labs companies, and hospital and home care setups, and to help facilitate the supply chain and the logistics in the move and all the complexities that we see in the healthcare chain. So would love to work with you, would love to connect with you, would love to, if you can reach out on LinkedIn, that we can talk about this together. Because there's a global healthcare transformation happening with all these different aspects, and I think it's for the better. But I also think that we all share a responsibility to really think how we can control cost, to make sure that we keep healthcare accessible and affordable for everyone on this globe. With that, I close my chat for today, and I thank the organizers for having me today.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and thank you for showing us how supply chain innovations can really help us create a more patient-centric healthcare system, and also many things for your efforts in making healthcare services more accessible and affordable, like you said. Thank you once again.
Prior to COVID-19, many people traveled abroad in search of personalized healthcare. But medical tourism has been mired in a deep slump amid the pandemic. So, what is the outlook for medical tourism going forward?
Medical tourism is certainly not a new concept, but it surely is a term and an idea that's been evolving for quite a while now. With new challenges arising, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, the medical tourism industry will also have to adapt to the new environment. So what we're going to do now is to invite another expert and listen to what he has to say about medical tourism and what lies ahead. We have Mr. Keith Pollard, the editor-in-chief of International Medical Travel Journal. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Pollard. Please take it away.
Welcome, and thank you to Kitty and to Medical Korea 2022 for asking me today to share my views on medical tourism, past, present, and future. The way I'd like to look at that today is to really kind of look at an extended period. We're going to look at where medical tourism is today. We're going to go back 20 years to the year 2000. And then we're going to look to the future for the next 20 years and to consider what we need to change to improve the situation of medical tourism. But first, let me explain what I do today in 2022. I work for a company called Languison, and I'm heavily involved in medical travel through our International Medical Travel Journal, the reports that we publish into international healthcare, and our medical travel conferences, seminars, webinars, and awards, which of course been mainly virtual over the last couple of years. But let's step back 20 years to the year 2000. What was it like then? What were you doing in the year 2000? Well, this chap, Tiger Woods, he was just beginning his career and he just won the UK's, the British Open Golf Championship. This gentleman, I'm sure you will remember in your country, Kim Do-young, he was the president of South Korea. And in your pocket, you probably didn't have an Apple or a Samsung phone. You had a Nokia. I think this is the 3310 model. And that's what we carried around with us then. And where was I in the year 2000? Well, I was here. This is London's Harley Street. It's the centre of London's private healthcare. It's where all the major London private hospitals do their business. And this hospital here is a hospital called the Harley Street Clinic. And if we go back to the year 2000, this was an international hospital where 50% of its patients and its revenue came from international countries around the world, a lot from the Middle East, but from Russia and China and countries like that. And these were very complex, very high value patients coming to London for their expertise. The competitors we had for those patients were really destinations like Germany and the USA. And most of these patients were not paying for their treatment. They were either funded by their government or their company. And that was what we called the international patient market back in the year 2000. But then things changed. And this phrase, medical tourism, arrived and became a thing. And it received a great deal of attention, both in the healthcare world and in the media. And there were great hopes of significant, massive, exponential growth in this field of medical tourism. What it did do was attract new entrants to the market. And these were countries, destinations, healthcare providers who felt they could get their share of the medical tourism market. And at one point, I think at IMTJ, we measured that more than half the countries in the world saw themselves as medical tourism destinations. We also saw the growth of what I call consumer medical tourism, whereas companies and governments had historically paid for many international patients. Consumers, patients in many countries, saw the opportunity to travel abroad for treatment, often driven by cost. Many of these patients were seeking treatments such as cosmetic surgery and dentistry, but also for elective surgery, hip and knee replacements, and so on. And of course, the growth, the multitude of facilitators that entered this market with the grand aim of helping patients to locate hospitals, doctors, and get the best price for their treatment. And if one thing happened over the last two years was our mobile phones changed, but we spend so much of our time online, and the internet and the web became a major source of information for our industry. Let's move on to 2010, and here's an article I wrote in the IMTJ, and I headed it Medical Tourism, Lessons from the California Gold Rush. And what I compared was the growth of medical tourism with the gold rush in the USA back in the 1800s. A massive growth in a market, or a suspected, a projected growth, which actually didn't deliver. And in terms of the gold rush, it wasn't the prospectors who made the money and found the gold. It was the people around that business who kind of made the money. The end result of the medical tourism sector failing to meet expectations was it failed to meet investor expectations. And I'd like to share a couple of examples with you. The one we have here is Healthcare International Scotland. And this was a major venture, a 500-bedded hospital that was built on the banks of the River Clyde in Scotland, with the aim of attracting thousands of international patients from across the world. It went through a series of ownerships, USA, Middle Eastern owners, and so on. But sadly, the expected demand for international patient care didn't arrive. And what is that hospital now today? Well, it went and was sold for a very low price to the Scottish National Health Service, the public sector. And here's another example. This is Health City, Cayman Islands. It still exists today. But in terms of when it was developed, its plans for a 500-bed hospital, a 5-star hotel, again with similar aims of attracting large numbers of international patients from the USA and from across the globe. And if you look at where it is today, you'll see that it had to really rethink what it was doing when those thousands and thousands of patients failed to arrive. The other issue that hasn't really been addressed yet within the medical tourism market is what happened over the last 20 years in terms of patient expectations. And here's an article from a UK newspaper. This one's back in 2018. And it tells the story of foreign cosmetic surgery, of cosmetic surgery going wrong when patients go abroad, and how it costs our National Health Service large sums of money. And this is one of the major challenges and issues within medical tourism that's developed over the last 20 years. A lack of regulation, a lack of control, and patients not getting what they expected to get when they travel abroad. And this is true across the world in terms of all destinations. And here's an example from your own country. This is back in 2015. This is from the South China Morning Post about the issues facing Chinese tourists and cosmetic surgeons within Korea. Now, these things are beginning to change, and many countries are correctly bringing in regulation to deal with these issues. So where are we with medical tourism today? Well, if there's one thing we have to acknowledge, it is the impact that COVID-19 has had on our industry. These are the kind of latest stats from the World Health Organization: 387 million cases, nearly 6 million deaths. And this is massively impact where we were going with medical tourism and where we will go in the future. Let's look at that impact. A 2-year embargo on travel. So when tourism and travel stopped, medical tourism and travel stopped as well. Patient numbers down close 80, 90, 100% across all destinations. A positive for me, I think, is the survival of the fittest. In many destinations, the smaller providers and the less well equipped and managed providers, and certainly this is true in facilitation, that only the best will survive COVID-19 and continue their business of medical tourism going into the future. A change in patient perceptions. Patients nowadays, and we know this from surveys that we've conducted, do not want to travel as far, and they're clearly worried about safety. and it will prompt indeed a major rethink for international healthcare. So let's look at the next 20 years and what the future holds for medical tourism. Well, how soon is global medical tourism going to recover? This is the view of the UN WTO's panel of tourism experts, and they're asked the question, when will we get back to the 2019 levels of tourism and travel in the world? And you can see they're not that optimistic. It's not going to be this year, it's not going to be next year. Generally, people are looking at 2024, and within Asia Pacific region, these experts are even less optimistic about the recovery of global travel, and I think that will certainly be reflected in terms of the recovery of medical tourism. There is some good news. Hospitals have been inundated by COVID patients. It's added to the cost and time of doing operations. It's reduced theatre time by around 20% in many hospitals because of the need to take COVID-19 precautionary measures pre and post operation. And for many hospitals, it's meant fewer beds because their beds have been occupied by COVID patients. And the end result of this means significant pent-up demand for regular healthcare, elective surgery. We're also seeing, and this is certainly a factor for the next 20 years, changing models of care and new competitors coming into the marketplace. And there's a couple of examples here of big international healthcare brands: Cleveland Clinic in the USA, Moorfields Eye Hospital from London, where they're extending their brand into their traditional international patient markets. So they're establishing their own related and linked hospitals in these markets to attract and treat their international patients. And one which I think should be of particular interest to hospitals in South Korea is the development of the Mayo Clinic network, where they're partnering with hospitals across the globe to share their expertise and extend their brand. And for South Korea, I think their activities in China, where they have a number of partnership hospitals now developed. We're also going to see significant changes in the model of care. If one thing's changed, it's telemedicine, telehealth, the whole tech impact of COVID-19 on healthcare generally, and in the future on medical tourism. Virtual consultations, robotic surgery, where there are now instances where surgery is being undertaken by a surgeon at a considerable distance. And of course, who knows what AI holds for us in the coming years. Changing patient perceptions. COVID-19 has had a significant impact on this, and what can we expect in the future? Well, you will certainly need to be able to answer these questions of every patient. The patient who asks, is it safe to come to your hospital or destination? The patient who says, how do you compare to this other hospital, this other surgeon, being able to prove the quality of your care and your expertise? What happens if something goes wrong? If I get home and I have a problem, how are you going to fix it? Do you provide insurance for this kind of issue? And what happens if something goes wrong, and what happens when I get home? So if we go from the past and this 2 or 3 year hiatus and then look to the next 20 years, what are my key messages? Number one, I would start with a blank sheet of paper. If you are a hospital or a destination in the medical tourism business, you need to completely rethink your strategy in the light of how COVID-19 has changed this business. You must look at the opportunities to strengthen and extend your brand in the way that Mayo and Cleveland Clinic and other hospitals are, to involve themselves in their key source markets. A telemedicine centre, a telehealth centre is a vital component of every medical tourism offering nowadays, and you should have a dedicated centre and team within your hospital. Exploit virtual and tech. And above all, we need to take the fear and uncertainty out of medical tourism. It's the one thing we really need to fix if we want the future of this business to really be fast and consistent growth over the next 10 years. Thank you for your time today. If you'd like to hear more from me and what we have to say at IMTJ, please visit www.imtj.com.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Us meeting through these means of communication, I think, is a key example of what the new normal would look like. So do you think this trend is here to stay or even replace the traditional way of treating patients?
Well, clearly COVID-19 has changed one thing about our lives, and that's the use of online and the use of things like Zoom and video consultation for everything we do and how we communicate with people. And that's even more the case with healthcare. And you can clearly see hospitals and clinics where their international patient flows have been blocked by COVID-19 and the restrictions on travel, how they have rapidly adopted telehealth, teleconsultation to support their international patient business. However, I think all of us as patients really do appreciate the need that we want to see doctors and specialists face to face. So I don't think by any means that will not replace medical travel. It will become part of medical travel and the services you provide.
I think I will have to agree with you that certain people will still prefer to meet their doctors face to face. So hopefully in the foreseeable future, the medical tourism industry will be revived. And when that day comes, which countries do you think will be sending a lot of their patients abroad, and which countries will be on the receiving end?
I think in terms of the sending countries, what I would call the source markets, it is those countries that have been seriously impacted by COVID-19, where there is this massive pent-up demand for healthcare. And those countries, those patients, the UK is a great example, unfortunately, where our government yesterday is forecasting National Health Service waiting lists of 10 million. That's out of a population of 67 million. So we're kind of ripe for the fruit, for the picking, for anyone who wants to target patients looking for healthcare. I think in terms of receiving countries or destinations, I think certainly countries like South Korea that have enhanced their reputation throughout this pandemic. So it is countries that have done well, countries that have not done well, and I would include the USA in this, particularly from the point of view of, we have some research that shows Chinese patients are much, much less confident of the USA than they were previously. So there's a real opportunity there for South Korea. I think South Korea is incredibly well positioned for the recovery of the medical tourism market. And there's some clear reasons for that. One, South Korea within COVID-19 has become one of the most respected nations in the world in terms of healthcare. COVID-19 was bad news, but it put South Korea on the map, and it hit the headlines. Your country hit the headlines across Europe, across the Americas, for how well you had managed COVID-19. I think the other factor which is important to me is the lead which South Korea has in technology. And as we see this growth in telemedicine, telehealth, AI, and so on, it is what you are very good at as a country, and you can exploit that within medical tourism.
Well, thank you very much. I do hope that many Korean medical professionals working in the field will keep your statement in mind. Those are very encouraging words. Thank you very much for your presentation and taking your time to talk to us out of your busy schedule. I do hope that we will be able to meet in person in the near future. Well, Well, we've all spent 2 long years in the dark pandemic tunnel, but now we are slowly seeing a light at the end of that tunnel, and that applies to the healthcare sector as well. I hope our discussion today with many experts from different fields under the theme Global Healthcare, a New Leap Forward, have presented new ideas and opportunities for you to really take that leap forward. That's all we have for part 1 of Medical Korea 2022 Global Healthcare and Medical Tourism Conference. Thank you all for watching, and please do join us again in part 2.